Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a tutorial to share with you today. We are designing our own patterns to make hand-stitched stuffed animals. I have some wool felt here for this project as well as some paper to do our patterns. I also have some books as illustration inspiration for this project. Today we're going to be working on a dolphin, and while this is not my recommended first project to do, I am working alongside my 14-year-old daughter, and this is the animal that she chose, and I really wanted to work with her own inspiration and passion. Now I do have some tips on how to make this a little bit easier, and I actually have a more simple project that is a much better first project. It is of a mouse, and that project is linked in the description box below. Now, my daughter is 14, and while she is a little bit older than the typical age that you would find this project in a Waldorf setting, you typically find it in grade 5, I do still think that it is an appropriate project for her grade. I also have this game here that has some beautiful illustrations, not just on dolphins, but on other sea animals as well. So I have a couple of these as potential illustration inspirations. However, because of the curvature of the dolphin and the whale for these images, I found that to be a little bit more challenging to work with. We have our color pencils and a piece of paper, and the first task is to do an illustration. It's best if you can do your illustration within the habitat of that animal, but we want to keep our illustration pretty simple. We're doing our illustration and our pattern on printer paper. This measures 8.5 inches by 11 inches. I find this to be a little bit too small for a project like this. You can always tape some extra pieces of paper together or work on a larger piece of paper. You also want to make sure that the detailed aspects of your animal, like for instance, if you're doing a trunk or limbs, or in this case, the dorsal fins and the rostrum, which is the nose part of the dolphin, you want to make sure that those are pretty big. If they're too small, you're not going to be able to turn them out properly, and the whole thing is not going to hold a good shape. So you do need to go a little bit bigger. And of course, once you do your actual pattern, you have to make a seam allowance. I simply put another piece of paper over my original drawing in order to get my silhouette to do my pattern, and I am doing a dotted line around my pattern about 1/4 inch for my seam allowance. I'm going to struggle with the tail. I'm not going to be quite sure how to do this. We have to bear in mind that this is a 2-dimensional pattern. We have to include a gusset in order to make it 3-dimensional. Now, this is something that I struggle with anyway, trying to visualize what this would be like in 3 dimension, especially with things like a tail and the fins. So there, we go through a couple of problems along the way, but we do make it out in the end okay. So the gusset is the part that's going to make your animal 3-dimensional. It's the part that's underneath the animal. So if you imagine an elephant, that's the part of the belly, that's the gusset. But in this case, we're going to have a gusset for underneath the dolphin, but I'm also going to do a very small gusset for the rostrum right around the melon, and that's the front part of the dolphin. In the end, it was probably not necessary, but I did want that flat, iconic shape, and the only way you can get that is with a gusset. Otherwise, you're going to have a seam up at the top. I've pinned down my pattern onto my felt, and now I am cutting it out. This was not the best felt, in part because it was difficult to turn out, and in part because it didn't have a lot of stretch. When we did our projects during the Waldorf Practical Arts training, we used boiled wool, and I really loved that material so much. I'm going to show you a project at the end. It feels good, it turns out well, and it has some stretch. I happen to have this 100% Holland wool felt on hand, but using this fabric and doing a dolphin made the whole project so much more challenging. It's time to stitch the project together. We are going to be using a back stitch. It's really important that this whole part of the project is hand done. We are not using a sewing machine for this. Now, this can get tedious, but at this age, this grade level, it's time for the students to practice their accuracy and precision. While it's okay if some of the stitches aren't quite right, we do want them pretty tight so that our whole project holds together. But this kind of practice is going to really help for future projects where precision is really important in the final project. So we're going to go behind our stitch and then pop out in front of it and then go back in where our previous stitch was. I'm going to take a break from stitching our project so that I can work on the gusset. I have my pattern and some white felt. I've pinned my gusset pattern to my felt and now we can cut it out. This is going to be a little bit challenging to fit it to my dolphin, but I'm going to try to make it work so that we can have a bit of a curvature to our dolphin. The dolphin fins were not lining up properly, and so I needed to make the gusset again. And this time I'm sort of estimating where the fins need to be based on my original gusset, which was incorrect, and my original pattern. So it takes a little bit of work in order to get it right. Thankfully, I had enough fabric for us to do a little bit of trial and error. And I'm also realizing that not only do I need a gusset for underneath the dolphin, I also need a gusset for the rostrum and melon area, and that is the front of the dolphin. So now this works a lot better, and it's time to continue that back stitch all around. This is very tedious and time-consuming, and I find that a lot of students can get discouraged at this point. It's really important to continue. You may take breaks. Usually in a classroom setting, these are projects that last the entire semester. In our homeschool setting, this is a project that lasted a week. So we really dedicated our time to this. So there can be, on occasion, some increased either frustration if a project is not going well, or just a lack of determination because it can get quite tedious. This is the area that I'm doing the gusset on top of the dolphin, and I have to stitch together 3 pieces on top, and at one point 4 pieces have to come together. So it is a little bit challenging to do this. There's a lot of detail work, and in the end you do need this to be a little bit bigger because once you turn it out, it's going to be much smaller, and we don't really want to constrict that part of the animal. Now, the fins are going to be pretty flat. There's not a lot of bulk with the fins. And so for that reason, you can still keep them big, but you don't need to stuff them as much. For the front of the dolphin, I ended up having it a little bit too narrow and long. And while it still looks like a dolphin in the end, those are small adjustments that once you do the project one time, you realize that everything has to be much bigger than you think, because once you stitch it together and turn it out, everything's going to be much smaller. Here's the somewhat fun part, and that is turning your project out. I am using the backside of a knitting needle in order to get into those smaller areas of our project. This is where I struggled for a good 15 minutes trying to turn the animal inside out. The problem was that the tail was done kind of poorly. And I worked so hard in order to get that last piece out. And then I realized it does not look like a dolphin tail. I really did this part of the pattern incorrectly. And I could have just left it the way it was, but I decided to go back to the drawing board and fix that tail. And while we do end up with a seam at the end of our project that would not have been there had the pattern been done correctly to begin with, I think the whole process is important, and it does give you so much more wisdom in working through these mistakes than just having a pattern that's perfectly done to begin with. So now I know how the tail flukes should look like, and now I just need to get my gusset for the tail fluke, which will be in the coordinating white felt. So this way I can just use my blue felt in order to cut out the white felt. And now we go back to stitching. There's so much stitching for this project. And we are doing this by hand. We're not going to be using a sewing machine for this project. Once that tail fluke is sewn, it's time to remove the old tail flukes, and then we're going to sew the new piece together. We do need to turn this inside out so that we can sew it properly. And that way when we turn the whole project right side out, everything is smooth on the outside, but you still will see a seam line where I put these 2 pieces together. So this was a lot easier to turn out. It still took a minute, still used the knitting needle, but once everything was turned right side out, it was time to stuff it. I'm using some wool bat to stuff my dolphin, and I wanted to not make some of the parts too filled, but in the end, I think that I probably could have added a little bit more to give it a little bit more structure, a little bit more softness. It's time to do the last stitching for our dolphin, and this time we're going to be using the ladder stitch or the zipper stitch. I'm working parallel to the opening and about a 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric. I'm doing a stitch across, straight across, and then going to the other side and going straight across on the other side as well. So it's parallel on both sides, and then when you draw your thread together, it closes and you don't even see the stitches. You can see them a little bit now, but once I pull this nice and taut, you don't really see those stitches anymore, and it keeps it nice and secure. So now I'm just doing the very last stitch. It feels really good to get to this point in the project, but there's one more thing that we need to do to really bring this project together. I'm going to hide that thread in my project by taking my needle all the way through the project, pulling it a little bit tight, and then trimming it off. And that way your excess thread is inside your project and it's nice and tight and you don't even see that knot. I have some black wool and a felting needle, and we're going to put some eyes on our dolphin. I'm taking a very tiny amount, twisting it around on my finger, and then placing it onto my dolphin. Using the felting needle, I'm going to poke that felt into my project very carefully. It doesn't take too much to make it adhere to the felt, but you want to also make sure that you're not going all the way through your project. Then I want to make sure that the other eye is lined up exactly where my original eye is. So I'm sort of eyeballing it and also using my hand as a guide by pinching the dolphin together to make sure that my other eye lines up well. The project is now complete. I really like the way that it turned out in the end. This was quite a challenge, so I do want to share with you some tips and some alternative fabric to make this project a little bit easier. This is the project that I worked on recently. It is a camel that I designed the pattern for. We are using boiled wool for this project, and it made it so much easier to work with, and I really love the way that it turned out. I also made a hedgehog, and for this one we used an old cashmere sweater, and I needle felted some wool on top, and of course we have our dolphin. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can find links to the resources that we used, as well as more inspiration to make your own hand-stitched animals. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see what we're crafting on a daily basis, you can find me on my website at pepperandpine.com.